Hi, my name is Chloe Carpenter and I'll present to you an article called Physical Punishment, Childhood Abuse and Psychiatric Disorders. There's been little research into physical punishment experienced in childhood and its effects in adulthood on psychopathology. Previous studies were limited in that they didn't isolate physical punishment from childhood abuse, they didn't contain a control group who weren't physically punished or abused, and they only looked at a small number of mental illnesses. And finally, they didn't adjust for the quality of the parental relationship. The study aimed to investigate what the authors called childhood adversity levels. The group of adult respondents who said they were not physically punished as children were adversity level 1, and they were considered the control group. The second level were adult respondents who said they were physically punished but not sexually or physically abused during childhood. And the third level, and the highest level of adversity, said they were physically or sexually abused during childhood. The study aimed to determine if there was a correlation between the level of adversity suffered by the adult respondents during their childhood and psychiatric illness during adulthood. The authors hypothesized that physical punishment, as a separate measure to abuse, is associated with adult psychopathology even after adjusting for socio-demographic factors and the quality of parental relationships. This study was secondary data analytic research. It used data from the National Comorbidity Survey, or NCS, carried out in the US in the early 90s. The article states that the data was statistically significant in the US. However, the reader is left to look into the NCS data themselves. The authors state that the NCS was representative of the US population on several indicators, including age, gender, race, marital status, region, and education. The NCS scope of study states that participants were from the US aged 15 to 54 in non-institutionalized civilian population. The study does not give any further information into the participants, and I'll discuss this later in limitations. This study used the NCS's public use dataset. The data was collected in the early 90s in 1992, and a structured psychiatric interview was carried out to the nationally representative sample, and a diagnosis was based on composite international diagnostic interviews. Data on the 5,877 respondents pulled from the NCS was divided into the 3 adversity levels I discussed earlier. The authors state that physical punishment was measured using the conflict tactic scales, which has been used as a measure of family violence elsewhere. Respondents were also asked how often the events occurred. The parental bonding index was used to assess adult perceptions of maternal and paternal bonding experience, and the study factored in socio-demographic variables, including education, household income, ethnicity, and marital status. The results of the study satisfied the aims of the data, and the data supports the hypotheses that physical punishment is associated with adult psychopathology. 35.5% of respondents were not physically punished, 48% were physically punished, and 16.5% reported that they were physically or sexually abused in childhood. The researchers, as aimed to do, were therefore able to identify 3 levels of childhood adversity within the available data. The data showed that individuals who were physically punished but not abused had greater odds of experiencing major depression, alcohol dependence, and externalizing problems than those who were not physically punished, however to a lesser degree than those who were abused. The authors conclude that future research into why parents were physically punished and why some individuals who are physically punished or abused do not develop poor mental health while others do would be beneficial. They also urged researchers to include the assessment of physical punishment when inquiring into childhood adversity. There were quite a few limitations that I hadn't covered in the article matrix, and after reading it I realised that probably the first thing was that I didn't grasp that it was secondary data analysis. While it is a valid form of analysis, there was a significant lack of discussion in the article, and any future study would need to go into more detail around who the participants were. The data from the NCS was collected in the early 90s, so could also be less relevant 16 years later in 2006 when the study was carried out. Overall, I felt information about the participants was not transparent and decreased the study's credibility in my mind. The age of the interview tools used too may be outdated in 2006. For example, the PBI or parental bonding index doesn't take into account non-male-female nuclear families. and the conflict tactic scales have minor physical punishment measures that some people, including myself, may consider abuse. The limitations identified by the authors around correlation not equating to causation included genetic factors, reverse directional relationships, a genotype that may protect against poor mental health outcomes, the recall reliability of participants, and shared environmental factors. To alleviate some of the limitations, I would suggest future studies should use twin studies, preferably longitudinal, although ethically this would be difficult, identifying a child who has been physically abused and not intervening. Having been physically punished as a child and weighing up the pros and cons using physical punishment in my son when he's older, I decided even prior to this study not to use physical punishment. There are studies that say there aren't negative outcomes, but it's not worth the risk in my opinion. There are also many studies that place physical punishment in the same category as abuse. However, that is highly emotive and doesn't give the true picture of the risks associated with physical punishment from a loving parent. I agree with the rationale that it's important to differentiate between abuse and physical punishment and have a control group. It's very difficult to factor in other childhood adversities that people have dealt with that impact on a person's mental health over a lifetime as well. Overall, the study was interesting and informative despite its limitations. I would like to see primary longitudinal research undertaking in this field. I apologise, I skipped the slide.